Good evening, guys, gals, and non binary pals. Hopefully, everyone is doing well. Thank you for tuning in tonight to our live stream presentation that is live on the Tattooed Historians Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter channels. We're all over the place tonight. So, I'm going to be pulling in questions and comments as we go through from the audience. You know the drill. Sorry to all my Twitter historians out there. I can't be posting anything in the comments section. So if you want to buy the book we're going to be talking about tonight, please go to my previous post here on Twitter, and you will see the link to purchase this book. And I will also be giving it the 40% off code across the bottom of the screen. Everybody on Facebook and YouTube, you are lucky because you're going to get the link in the comment section, and it will be there for you throughout the entire event. And again, watch out for that code on the bottom to get your 40% off from UNC Press. And thank you to UNC Press for allowing me to give that code to my followers. It really means a lot. And I hope I can save you all some money in these trying times. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Her Cold War by Dr. Tanya Roth. Women in the U.S. military, 1945 to 1980. I had to say U.S. military because someone from Germany asked me if it was going to be about German women in the military, and I'm like, only if they immigrated. That's the only way it's going to happen. So Tanya Roth is going to be on with me here and shortly. Tanya she received her PhD in history from Washington University. She teaches history at the Mary Institute and St. Louis Country Day School. It would help if I hit the right button. Tanya, good evening.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing tonight?
I am doing well, as long as I'm hitting the correct buttons. I just took myself off the live stream there for a second. No, I'm doing well. Thank you for being on tonight, and thank you for an amazing background.
Thank you. I try.
It's just awesome. I know that this book came out in 2021, and we're just now getting around to meeting you and me reading this book, and it was an awesome read, and I really appreciate that. Before we dive into it, though, I do want to ask you about your background as far as your educational background and your experience being, enjoying history. And where did that spark come from, Tanya?
I think that started really young. I have a lot of my childhood books behind me. I was somebody threw historical fiction in my hands way back in the day. I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And I mean, those are the things you notice in retrospect that, I've always liked reading historical fiction. I'm still a huge fan of historical fiction. So I think that kind of sparked it. I remember really vividly, I don't know the book that I was reading, but I remember reading something in elementary school and going, wow, is this true? It was a novel, but I was really interested in, wow, did this stuff actually happen? And so I think for a long time through my childhood, it was a lot of me thinking about, well, is this a true fact in this book? Is this something that really happened? And then wanting to figure out and chase it down. So I think I've always been curious. I also read a lot of detective novels, Nancy Drew, so I wanted to figure things out.
Nice. Yeah, that's actually how I also got started. It was historical fiction. And then I kind of rebelled against it. And I'm like, I don't want to read that. I want to read the true facts. And now I'm getting back into historical fiction. So that's awesome. Yeah. And I also grew up on Mike Hammer novels from back in the day because my grandfather used to. So yeah, we're on the same wavelength when that's coming through. What about your educational background, Tanya? What was your education like coming up through to earn your doctoral degree?
So I fell into my history major as an undergraduate. It was not my first pick. There were a lot of picks, but I ended up. I'm going to say my parents ruined me, but they didn't ruin me. When I was 5, they were in graduate school and they were writing master's thesis. I always assumed everybody did that. My parents never ever pressured me, but I just remember getting to college and being like, yeah, I'm going to write a thesis.
Nice.
I found out that's not really what most people do. But University of Missouri Columbia did have that as an option. I was an English major, but I didn't have the grades. You had to be an honors student in the English department in order to do that. But I had the grades for the history department. They're like, yeah, just take a seminar. So I took the only thing that sounded interesting, which was gender in World War I. I don't remember what else they offered. I don't even know. And that was a European-centered course. It just happened to be, oh, that sounds good. I'll take that one. And it kind of fell me into everything. I was really fortunate to have a number of really passionate professors at Mizzou, as it's known. I did a lot of European history, but like I had a really important course on gender, race, and American popular culture, which completely changed my understanding of like everything around me that I'd grown up seeing and understanding. And I had no exposure to gender history or LGBTQ history or any of that.
Mhm.
And I was just fascinated. And I thought that was it. I thought I'd get a PhD in English, and it turned out I was way more interested in history. So moved to St. Louis and took a chance. Very fortunate. Washington University in St. Louis is right here. Excellent graduate program, fully funded for 6 years at the time. I'm not sure how that's changed now. But I was very fortunate to get into that program. I came in saying, yeah, I want to study women in war, women in the military, something like that. So I just kind of had that hint that stayed with me from my World War I and gender seminar that I
Mm.
just couldn't let go of. I was fascinated.
Wow, that's awesome. When I was going through grad school, one of the books I liked was actually a gender history of the Spanish American War. So that's kind
Ooh,
of I forget, and I'm a terrible historian because I forget the title.
I'm really
we,
bad with titles too.
yeah, we've read so much. I'm like, which one was it? I don't, because people ask me who wrote it. I'm like, don't ask me that.
Right?
I
I'm
don't.
like, I can tell you the cover, and that's about it.
Right. Yeah, I'll show you the cover. Yeah, that's good. But speaking of covers, I like this cover, and
I love this cover. Isn't that gorgeous?
a couple people were like, "Wow, that is a really cool cover."
I'm really hoping that UNC wins some awards for that cover because it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
That image on the cover is from a 1970s Marine recruiting ad on the National Archives website.
Oh yeah.
Um, and in its original context, I don't even think that. I mean, it's a really bland 1970s ad, and my editor was like, "We could do something with that." I was like, "I trust you," and it's just incredible.
Yeah. It turned out to be amazing. I love the use
Yeah,
of the negative space and everything for the
so beautiful.
facial features and stuff. It's just really awesome. Uh, and I've had a couple people on Twitter say, "Wow, that's a really cool cover." And I think someone saw my banner for tonight and they thought I did that for the banner. I'm like, no, 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 I'm not that good. I can only add text. That's all I can do. Uh, but this is out in both hardback and paperback
It
now.
is. Yeah.
And everyone, the link is in the chat, but the code to get 40% off is floating around down there underneath us right now. Tanya, where did the idea to come up with, or where was the idea originally for this book? Since you had done a kind of European centric look at gender in the First World War, what was the difference in this method?
This one, I kind of fell into. I'm a person who I think I fall into a lot of things because I, I'd like to say I don't have a lot of maybe the fact I didn't have a lot of background in some of this. Like I didn't really have a sense in my head of here's the narrative of women's history in the 20th century. I just had like little bits of knowledge here and there. And
Mhm.
I loved the World War One stuff. I thought it was fascinating. I don't even think I really understood distinctions between US historian and European historian, if that makes sense.
I understand.
I did a background in world history as well, so I kind of just like everything.
Right.
But there was a Cold War undergrad course, upper level undergrad course, my first semester at grad school, and I was like, oh yeah, I should take that. That fits in the time frame that I'm interested in. I know I like 20th century, and of
Mhm.
course, as a graduate student, I had to do something more than the undergrads. And that fall, this was like the fall of 2005, I think. The Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. had just put out their book, A Defense Weapon Known to Be of Value, about women in the Korean War era.
Okay.
And it had just come out. I was incredibly lucky, and I was like, "Oh, this is great." I
Right.
knew there was women in World War II. I had a little bit of knowledge about that and some context there, but I also had the sense that everybody does World War II, which is not true. But I think growing up in the end of the 20th century, early 2000s, when you know the Greatest Generation, very interested in that. My grandfathers both fought in the war, but I was like, what's the stuff I don't know about? And that's where I think it honestly hit me right there was that book was, oh,
Hmm.
hey, there's some stuff that happens after World War II and nobody else was talking about it. I'm like, well, this is interesting. Let's see what I can do with this.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of World War II, it's amazing how much to me, and you go into detail in the book, how much Eisenhower's involved in this. Because when we think World War II, we think Eisenhower and Supreme
Yes.
Allied Commander, and obviously he sees so many women in uniform at that time doing what they were doing. I wondered what he thought afterwards, and you go into that.
Yeah, that was something that was not in my dissertation because a lot of this came out of the dissertation, as so many first books do for historians. But I didn't have that in my dissertation. I went straight to the legislation, the 1948 Women's Armed Services Integration Act. But for the book, I thought, well, wait, hold on, there's got to be something. Eisenhower wrote a little book right after the end of the war where he talks about his time in Europe and North Africa and has some really great passages about his experiences working with women. I went, oh, there we go. There you are.
Yeah, that's a good start.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was I love that piece. I was also really fortunate to do research at the Eisenhower Presidential Library out in Abilene.
Right.
They're fantastic people. It's been a long time since I was there, but that was a wonderful week-long adventure. Like they're like, we'll get you a bike to ride if you need a bike to ride. Do you need anything else? What other information can we get you? Stayed at a house that was a bed and breakfast where the
Nice.
original owners had a kid who was friends with Eisenhower growing up. It was just this cool experience to get to go experience Eisenhower, and so I'm kind of fond of him.
Yeah, very small town kind of feel with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. What were some of your other research methods, Tanya, with this, other than going to that specific location? What were some other places you went to?
Pretty much scouring everything I could. A lot of presidential libraries,
Mhm.
and they would very much tell me, well, we don't have stuff on women in the military. And I would say, yes, well, you have this information over here. The Lyndon Johnson Library had a fair amount. The Kennedy Library had some interesting materials as well. But everybody from Eisenhower. The Nixon Library wasn't around at the time, although I did use some materials there. I didn't get to the Carter Library, but every presidential library from Eisenhower, Truman through,
Mhm.
we'll say Nixon, I hit their libraries. The Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. was such an invaluable resource. But I also did interviews with a number of female veterans who I was really lucky to get in contact with. I was editing the HNet email listserv H Minerva while I was in graduate school, and it's a
Mhm.
list that's dedicated to women in war, women in the military. So that became one way to find connections, and then national organizations. And there's a local branch in St. Louis where I live. So I was able to find a number of people who were like, yeah, I'm happy to talk to you and tell you my experiences.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, that's those oral histories are just so necessary, you know.
They're
And
so rich.
yeah, yeah. What were there anything? How should I say this? Were there any kind of hiccups along the way where it was kind of like you hit a brick wall, or the stuff that you wished were there wasn't there? You know, what were some of the challenges you faced in the research process?
Yeah. Um, there's definitely a few. One of the things that stands out to me right now, especially thinking about the recent decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, is very hard to find information as I was looking at the time about servicewomen and abortions. There's a little bit of information. There's some stuff that happens, and I talk about in the book. It would have been really interesting to get some more insights. At one point, I found a document that said, well, we don't know how many women have had abortions in the military, but so there's this whole area of women's reproductive health in the military that at the time if I were looking now, I know there's some great scholars who are doing some work on that. They've probably
Mhm.
found things that I might have missed, but I remember thinking, oh, if I could just find this, how interesting would it be? But also at the time I was looking at that material, I think it was one of those topics that started looming larger as I spent more time with the material, and didn't quite wasn't able to get back to the archives in a way where I might have been able to go, where's this thing right here?
Right.
But there's so many things. The National Archives in Washington D.C. and College Park, Maryland,
Mhm.
especially College Park, hundreds of thousands of materials, and I know I only scratched the surface, and I'm sure there are things in there that I completely missed or didn't know how to find. But there's just so much. Like it's a topic that for a long time I think people said, well, there's nothing here. But
Mhm.
once you start looking, there really is quite a lot of material, and then it's just a matter of finding a way to get through it all.
Yeah. That that's the universal thing with research, right? Sometimes it's just it's not there, or it's not the right time to find it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That the one sentence that I really that really hit me in the book had to do with the military as a microcosm of the larger society. like societal norms
Yeah.
and stuff. And that was like, I've studied military history for years, and I never even like, that was the light bulb moment for me where I'm like, wow, now that makes total sense, and it was just right there. Do you think a lot of people don't realize that, or do you think that that's kind of like one of those things where we often see the military as separate from the social entity, and that plays a game with us in that way as researchers and as just civilians?
I think it's kind of a little of both. I kind of wonder if the permanent addition of women in the 1940s, even though it's such small numbers, whether that starts making it like, oh, when we actually start looking at the people in it and the way they're setting up women's service, that makes us pay a little more attention and go, oh, they're mimicking what happens here. So I don't know whether maybe bringing the women in did some of that, but I do think that we just um, so much of traditional military history has been written operationally and talking about the battles and the weapons. And I teach high school, and it's still more common for students to come in and be like, oh, let me tell you about these planes. I cannot tell you about a single military plane or tank or gun. It's just not where my information is. But there's so many more people now working on the people aspect of who's in the military and what does this look like and how do these dynamics work. And so I do think it ends up being it's separate, but it's a place where so many of our social ideas play out.
Mm-hmm. It kind of plays into popular culture as well. And one of
Yeah.
the wild things that I had never heard about till I read your book was, and I'd love for you to touch on for my audience, is the 1952 Miss America pageant. I have never heard this before, and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me.
Oh my gosh, I
So I'd
love.
love to hear more about this.
So this comes in with a line of my research that I'm personally very fond of. One of the later chapters in the book is I'm going to check my number because I don't remember the numbers. Um, yeah, chapter 7 about the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. Dakowitz. I'm kind of obsessed with Dakowitz, and it may not sound related, but that's how I found out about the 1952 Miss America pageant. In the early 50s, this committee gets formed by the Assistant Secretary of Defense, still exists today, still focuses on issues related to women's service. And there are in the National Archives and many other places, you'll find Dakowitz scrapbooks that were kept by individual members and then ended up in the National Archives. So imagine like a mid 20th century scrapbook with black pages and those little black corners that hold the photographs
Mm-hmm.
down and things like that.
Yep.
And somebody had put together all these newspaper clippings about things that Dakowitz did. And I opened the box and there was this huge scrapbook and it said Miss America pageants. I'm like, what the heck is going on here? I had
Yeah.
looked at in the National Archives, there are a bunch of recruiting journals, which were like newsletters sent to recruiters about recruiting opportunities and things they could pull on in popular culture to get people's attention. But this was very different. This was looking at what was Dakowitz doing to help promote women's service. And one of the early ideas they had was, well, we got to go where the women are, and women are in the Miss America pageant. I don't think they were trying to recruit the Miss America contestants themselves, right?
Right.
They're really there because they figured that people are going to come and they're looking to these young women in the pageant as the epitome of American womanhood. Like, here are women who, during World War II, were doing community service, who had that look, that glamorous association of, everything it might mean to have your hair and your makeup and your poise and to know what it was to be an American woman. And so they try to capitalize on that. They bring recruiters from each of the women's services to the pageant. I don't know a whole lot about what they did at the pageant, but my understanding is they were probably manning a booth with brochures and talking to young women.
Right.
I believe they're also in the parade, and that was the first year that we have a grand marshal for the Miss America parade, and it is Marilyn Monroe.
Obviously. Yeah.
But she's up
Yeah.
and coming. It's before she's really hit it.
Right.
And yeah, and that leads to my favorite moment, which the photograph is available online. You can find it, but there's a few articles in that scrapbook that said, so here's this photograph of Marilyn Monroe with 4 service women behind her, and somebody in the Army office saw that photograph and was like, nope, get rid of it, because they thought that Marilyn's dress was too low cut. And by
Wow.
our standards, it doesn't look that way at all.
Oh
But
yeah.
they're looking at, the women in the uniforms are up to here, and Marilyn's a little lower.
Right. Right. A
And
little.
a little lower, and it just gets all this press. I was able to chase down a few different things related to it, like Marilyn a few years later being like, I didn't see what was wrong with it. Um,
Right.
but the image of her from the Miss America parade, which you can find the footage on YouTube and see her silently waving to the crowds. Some of that footage then was the cover of the first Playboy issue a year or two
Hmm. Wow.
later. So I don't know, maybe that army guy was a little prescient.
Yeah. Yeah. Apparently. Apparently. That kind of Miss America pageant, especially the 1950s, and this idea of service and womanhood in the American sense, it's still a very white centric middle class way of looking at womanhood, or what it's very Leave It to Beaver
It
still
is.
at that time.
Yeah, I wonder. I haven't found stuff, but it would have been interesting to see whether you ever had some of that appearing on early television, for example, right? Because I
Mhm.
don't think we ever got. Well, Lucy was married on I Love Lucy, so we were never going to have Lucy go join the military. But that there's definitely movies that portray that, and it is. It's very much. I think because all the leadership in the military at the time is white,
Mhm.
predominantly male. All the women who have leadership roles are also white, and in the government, it's also politicians who are basically all white and mostly male. So they're going with the image that they're thinking of their daughters, their granddaughters, their sisters, and they don't really get challenged to think of this any other way. But Truman desegregated. Sorry, yes, Truman. Sorry, I'm all of a sudden my brain goes between Truman and Eisenhower and thinks I'm mixing them
Okay.
up because Eisenhower was still a general and Truman's the one who's president.
That's all right.
Because Eisenhower's so involved, as we were talking about.
Yeah.
But Truman desegregates the military 6 weeks after Congress decides that women can be in the military.
Mhm.
So the women Marines and the Women's Air Force are integrated well before the men's services and even the Army and the Navy as well. So we look at the men's services to see where a lot of the challenges of desegregation play out, but the women's services were doing it well before the
Mhm.
rest of the military.
Mhm. Did the non-white service women see that as a way to try to be seen as more, how should I say it, like American, really? Because you see a lot of African American men going in the First World War, and they're like, this is where we can prove that we are worthy of equality, and they do it again
Yeah,
in the Second World War, and then we still need the civil rights movement, and we're still having questions today about equality. Do women in the post Second World War era who are from minority communities, there may not be many, but do they see that as a step forward for them to try to make a difference?
I think so. There's definitely the none of these women tend to see themselves as activists, so they're
Mm,
not consciously or they're not. I haven't found evidence of them talking about like, oh yeah, I joined because I wanted to make a difference in civil rights. But I think it is part of that tradition that they're very aware. Women who come of age after World War II to join the military, who are probably, 18, 19, 20, would have grown up with the double V rhetoric of World War II. They'd be
mm,
very aware of what the correlation between military service and citizenship is for many African Americans. If nothing else, it's certainly perceived of as a really great place to have a job. So by the early 1960s, Jet magazine and Ebony magazine are printing articles saying, look, here's this high ranking woman who's an African American woman, and here's all the different opportunities that came to her. Um, what I would love to get more information on, and I think as a white woman, this is where, first of all, my oral history methods, when I did them, not they're good, right? But I was first time out of the gate. I know a whole lot more now,
mhm,
but I did not ask the questions, and I did not have a wide enough range of service women who were minority women who can talk about those experiences. So I'm hoping that we get some more researchers in the next few years who can go talk to those women and perhaps coming from a different racial identity and different background be able to get us more information, because I think that's a vitally important part of Cold War history that we don't yet have. But from what I can tell, yes, I do think that for many women, at least economic opportunity, but also I think that citizenship connection too.
mhm. we brought up Marilyn Monroe earlier, and that leads me to cinema and movies. We can kind of hinted towards TV and popular culture with Lucy, but they really try to instill that into cinema as well, right? Where they're like,
Yeah,
here, they're trying to showcase a woman on screen in uniform to be the ideal powerful woman of that time, what they would consider
yeah.
powerful woman of that time, weren't they?
Yes. There's two movies in the 1950s that really stand out. Never Wave It a Whack, I think, is probably
Mm,
the more popular of the two. Not that everybody's seen it today, but I think it's the one that you might see in passing more if you're reading about 1950s theater or cinema, for example. And
mm,
that one takes more of a comedic approach. There's more, it's kind of like, oh, wait, can women do this? And I don't think it's not as much a serious film, but neither is Skirts Ahoy. I kind of like Skirts Ahoy a whole lot.
mm,
I didn't think I would. Like watching 1950s movies about the military, I was like, all right, what's going to go on here? Because I also
yeah.
watched Private Benjamin from the early 80s with Goldie Hawn. And I
Oh
would
yeah.
say that if you've seen Private Benjamin, Never Wave It a Whack has some overlap with it, although Private Benjamin goes a little more. Um, Private Benjamin's playing for the jokes a little bit more. You
Mm,
know what I mean? But
yeah.
there's still that element. So Never Wave It a Whack, the woman who joins the military, does it on a lark, and she doesn't know how to do anything. And she's one of those people who has spent her whole life being served and has never lifted a finger, and now she has to make her bunk and do this. So it portrays military life very well. It's just also the main character, not so great. But Skirts Ahoy focuses on the Navy, and it's got some really great lyrics and scenes that really get at, hey, here's what it means to be a woman joining the military.
Mm,
That I don't think we expect, but all of them really showing, here's these women, very professional, very put together. You can do this too and have a great time.
mhm. Did we have with that kind of popular culture movement from the 52 Miss America film and so forth? Did we have kind of a downturn in that during the Vietnam era, like we do with some other works? Because we see there's just like this downturn, especially in the late 60s, of military movies involving women. It seemed like it was more John Wayne than anything
I
else.
think you're right. I think that they never really do a whole lot. Like Hollywood doesn't get too enamored of women in the military. They kind of remain side plots or World War II movie feet. Like there's still movies being made about World War II, right? So those you get those appearances that are kind of the little bitty glimpse ones. But I think that the Vietnam War definitely, by that time, the focus is all on the draft. It's focused on the men who are fighting there, probably a little more nurses. So I think the closest thing we get is
Mm,
MASH, and the
right.
nurses of the 4077. Um, I love that show. And since I didn't do anything with nurses in my book because of practical reasons. It's a
Mhm.
lot of field to cover. But
Yeah.
I think that's the closest thing we get is really okay, the nurses, because they're going to be the majority of the women who go to Vietnam,
Hmm.
be the nurses.
No, I appreciate that fact about the book, Tanya, because far too often, especially when I talk to other male military historians, they're kind of like, "Oh yeah, the women were nurses," and it's like they did so much more than that. It
Yeah.
wasn't just nursing, and I appreciate the fact that it was a component in your research, but it wasn't the plethora of.
Right. Yeah, and I think that came out of my undergraduate World War One stuff because all my World War One stuff was women as nurses. Because in World War One, that's the majority of what women are doing, even if they're volunteering. And in World War One, it's many women who are not professionals. They get
Mm,
6 weeks first aid training, and then they're off to do whatever they can. But by the time we get to Korea and Vietnam, um, before the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948, we've got Congress also setting up the Army Navy Nurse Act and saying, yes, here are the guidelines to have women. The Army Nurse Corps is basically all women. The Navy Nurse Corps is all women. Their bigger fights in those components is about letting men come in the Cold War because that's an entirely different conversation. To bring men into a women-dominated area, so there's certainly women in my book who were in medical professions, but the professional nurses, like that's excellent. There's been excellent work done on that by Kara Vick. Um,
mm.
and others. So I was like, I'll just let them keep that. There's enough separation.
That's their lane.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, I understand that. Uh, when we talk about those components, and we talk about the microcosm of the larger society, there are times where it seems like it breaks free from those microcosms, because it kind of feels like this is the first equal pay for equal work for people who are doing the same job but have
Yeah.
different gender identities.
Yeah, and I think that that's in some ways really huge, and in some ways maybe not, because it is such a microcosm. But also, like, here's women making equal pay, and they're literally going, here's the same, we're at the same rank, and if you are at this rank and you're a man, and you're at this rank and you're a woman, it's the same pay. And we're classifying our jobs really in a really set structure. And certainly there are jobs that women can't access, so they're not accessing hazard pay, combat pay, and those other benefits that might make the money go higher for men.
Right.
And there's certainly a whole lifestyle that goes with it, like your housing and your uniforms and other things. But to have a structure that says we're not going to take gender into account for the base pay rate, it can be done. I think maybe that's one of the messages we should take away, is it can be done. And that's something that we haven't done as well getting at outside of the military.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, still some work to do
Yeah.
there on that front. No pun intended. Uh, the big elephant in the room for me when I cracked open this book was, I remember talking with some World War II vets, and they were, they were obviously set in their ways. They were in their 80s, and they had their mind set on how things were back in those days, and Korean War vets the same way. And they all would say, I would ask them about, hey, did you ever see any WACs or Women's Army Corps members or anything like that? And they would always be like, yeah, they're a bunch of lesbians. So when I opened this book, I was like, let's see the gender, the sexual history of these women, because far too often there's this kind of umbrella thing. Well, if a woman wants to do that job, she must be this way or that way or whatever the case may be. What was it like doing that research on those kind of studies? Because there are certain people who will always be set in that mindset because their grandfather told them that, or something along that line.
That was in oral history interviews, several oral history interviews that I did with women who, to my knowledge, are straight, but I don't always know their sexual identity. Regardless, they said, "Oh yeah, I was told that if you went in the military, you were either a slut or a lesbian." In their words, like that was the way they got described. And I think that was a really common conception, that just across the board, that was the reputation. And so I think it's interesting to think about, because we don't know for sure, because there were no records, how many women in the military did identify as lesbian or bisexual, or transgender. That information comes a little later, towards the end of my period. But certainly it's something the military is thinking about. It's something that women in the military are thinking about. There's some excellent work done about how World War II, by Alan Marube's book on World War II, is a coming out experience, because for men and women, military service provides the space where, small town, maybe you've only known a few people, or even a big city, here all of a sudden, whether you're a gay man or you're lesbian, you've got opportunities where you can meet others who maybe like you in a way that you never had before. So there are opportunities for people who do identify as lesbian or gay. So it does become a space for many women who are lesbian to say, yeah, this is where I want to be. The challenge is that the military is like, we don't want you. And they mean it really seriously. So we get the witch hunts in the 1950s. And Margot Kennedy, her book, where she looks at how the United States has structured citizenship and defined it. She was the first one to go find the homosexuality discharge files that I use in one of my chapters to talk about, and they're remarkable to look at. They're heartbreaking to read. You cannot tell from looking at these whether any of these women were lesbians or not. But the lengths to which people went to accuse other people in these several witch hunts that happened in the 50s, or the lengths to which the government tried to prosecute this, lie detector tests, bringing in psychologists. They're really seeing homosexuality as a disease that they have to root out and take care of. but it's not a disease, and they don't know how to how to address it, even if it were.
Right.
So they're telling women that, if you will confess and name, it's sort of like a communist witch hunt.
I was
Name
gonna
the other
say it's
way.
like the Red Scare.
It really is. So by the time you get to the mid 50s, there's
Hmm.
enough of people in power who say, this probably doesn't look good for us. We probably shouldn't do any witch hunts. So if there's a woman who's clearly in violation, she needs to go. But it's not going to be something that they're trying to search for. So there's a number of women who do keep themselves in the closet as they serve, or I'm certain we have a number of cases where we have women who are out to some degree while they're serving, and they just know who should know about it and who shouldn't. Um, but yeah, it's an important topic in this time period until we get to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then the repeal of that in 2011. It's a big issue.
Yeah, the whole idea surrounding sexual health also was wild because the army or the military in general. Sorry, I'm from an army family, so I
That's
usually
all right.
the military in general really acts like, well, the guys are going to do it anyway, so we're just going to tell them how to do it safely. The women should not be doing it at all.
Yes.
And that's one thing where I'm like, wow, we really
Yeah.
got to come to terms with this, don't we?
Yeah, and I have to admit, I didn't go looking to see if there were a lot of cases of women who were kicked out because of sexual behavior.
Mhm.
I think we probably have a few. I'm sure I have a file somewhere, and probably someone doing that work be like, "Hey, wait, I know." So I'm
Yeah.
sure it happened, but I think more that we get the best evidence you get that a woman is sexually active is if she gets pregnant, and that's where the military drew the line. You're pregnant, you're out of the military, they're presuming that you're married, and in which case they're like, congratulations, go raise your family.
Right.
But if it's a woman who's not married, that's going to be a whole nother, well, now you're being discharged because you were breaking moral behavior
Hmm.
guidelines.
Right. You're being judged differently
Exactly.
than your male counterpart is, or your male comrade is
Yeah.
in that case. That was one thing that I've heard a lot about, where some women who I talked to who served during the Cold War era were talking about, well, if you did this, you're kicked out immediately. And then in your book, there were kind of like instances where that wasn't necessarily true, but it's not being told that it's not true to these women.
Exactly. I think a lot of situational things that the guidelines say one thing, like guidelines say as soon as you're pregnant, you're out, or if this happens, you're out. But I think it so much also depends on those relationships that you have with your commanding officer and the people that you worked with directly and who's in charge and maybe what manpower needs are at the time too. There's so many variations. There was a special issue. I cannot remember the journal that I got to look at a couple years ago that focused on World War II. And I remember reading a really great article about two case studies of nurses who were pregnant in World War II. And one of them was out like that. And the other one, her commanding officer was like, no, you can stay as long as you need to. So that was
Hmm.
a moment where I went, oh, yeah, okay. I can see how those more immediate relationships you have might control more of whether you're going to get the boot today or tomorrow.
Right. As these years roll on until the end of this era of your book is concerned, we start to see this weird flip of where now women need men to come in and do some of the work to support the system that they are in charge of.
Yeah.
I never knew that, and I was like, wow, what kind of in my mind, I'm like, okay, what kind of soldier or officer or whatever decides I'm going to volunteer over here when women are seen as a feminine service branch, the men who kind of are like, yeah, I'll go help. What was the research like on that topic? Because I had never known this at all.
And I'll be honest, that kind of came in towards the end for me. I was because you might be thinking of the part in the conclusion where I talk about Mildred Bailey integrating her staff
Yeah,
with men coming in.
yeah,
Um, and that's where I honestly, I was rereading her oral history transcript because a lot of the early female generals have some really great oral history transcripts. Some of them have multiple oral histories that they did, and they're all fascinating. But of course, when you're doing a project like this over time, the things that you look for the first read through of a transcript are going to look a lot of different than later. And I
right.
stumbled onto this. I was like, wait a second. never thought about this, because they did have at the time, by the 70s, you've got the Women's Army Corps has their own headquarters in Alabama at Fort McClellan. So imagine, my perception of it was, this is an all-female enclave, right? It's the Women's
Right.
Army Corps Training Center. I don't know how many men were actually working there. There must have been some. But when she integrates her office and that question of bringing a man in, and yeah, military leaders are like, what man's gonna want to work with a bunch of women? I had not thought about that. And then I think because they then get rid of the women's services so quickly after that and erase those formal boundaries, that
Hmm.
it kind of makes it a moot point. But the Women's Army Corps was definitely a space where you could see that play out a little bit more, I think. It's fascinating. I'd love to know who that guy was and if he did an oral history, and see what he thought about it, all of it.
Yeah, yeah, I would love to. I hope there's an oral history out there
I hope so.
on that, because that would be just amazing to read through.
Yeah.
When you're going through all of your work and piecing this all together, this large puzzle together, what was like the most inspiring thing you got out of it? I already asked what the most challenging research thing is. What was the most inspiring thing that you've located in your research that was like, wow, I didn't know that, but that was an amazing thing, amazing moment?
I do think, as a process part of it, I do think the oral histories really became that for me.
Mhm.
I was not planning to do oral histories for this project originally. I would have been content going to the archives, but I mentioned earlier I did another field in world history on the side, and I
Mhm.
teach a lot of world history today. And I had a really great mentor who taught African history in graduate school, and he said to me, Tanya, you're talking about people who are still alive. Why are you not interviewing them? He's like, I'm an African historian. We talk to people because that's where our history is. And I went, okay, I guess I'll do it, because I have this thing where I get scared to death, but I love doing it once I get into it.
You hate the initial part of it.
It's the initial part, and
Yeah.
also I don't have a military background. Again, my grandfathers both served, but they were long dead by this point. My father was not in the Vietnam War. I don't have direct connections, so I didn't
Mhm.
know if they'd take me seriously or what would happen. But that, I think, I would finish a conversation, I'd be like, "Whoa, this is so cool!" Because it might have confirmed pieces for me, but it also, much of the time, gave me new insights into jobs and experiences, and just it really did make it come alive. And then
Mhm.
I had stuff I could go back to the archives and compare the information and go, okay, like most women I talked to said, oh, yeah, if you got married, you had to leave. Not true. But you don't in an interview say to anybody, yeah, no, you're wrong, because
Right.
it doesn't matter. The truth is that was the perception that they had, that you had to leave when you got married. And that perception is really powerful for telling me as a historian something about what the military was like.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I loved that. And then also, anytime I opened up something and found like the Marilyn Monroe story, or any
Yeah.
number of oral histories where people are talking about this thing that happened, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more.
Right. Right. What was that process like for you to do your initial oral histories, because you are so nervous? Yeah, a lot of us are so nervous asking, could
Right.
we ask you about your service, or could we ask you about your time in this factory, or whatever the case may be, whoever we're interviewing. Sometimes it's hard just to ask, because
It is.
a lot of us historians are kind of timid. We're introverts, and we're just
Yeah,
like, I don't want to bother you. So what was
exactly.
it like? What was it like overcoming that kind of hurdle where it's like, okay, I might be uncomfortable doing this, but I should do it.
Yeah, there was uh, definitely. So if you go on the Library of Congress website, the Veterans History Project, and you do a search for Tanya Roth, you'll find transcripts of some interviews that I did, or you can also find the recordings. You can listen to every single misstep I made. It's a lot of nervous laughter from me, and like rephrasing questions, and trying to edge into it cautiously.
Mm,
Those are mostly, I think, in particular, the ones I did on the telephone with a recording device. But I think one of the best parts was, I had a few friends who, like a really good friend of mine in graduate school, both of her parents were in the Navy. Like they met in Hawaii in the Navy in the 70s. She's like, you want to interview my parents? I'm like, yeah. That was probably one of the best, because I had the report with their daughter, and I talked to the mom, and I talked to both of them together, and that was like, oh, cool. So anything that came through a personal connection. Another good friend in grad school, her mother-in-law had served. Oh, great! Here's another one. It just sort of had a few people come out of the woodwork. Those helped give me comfort with it.
Hmm.
And then when I found the local VFW, the women's post here, I got to go out with one of their members, and that helps so much. I think that helped give me my confidence that I was doing it right. I
Hmm.
knew what I was doing, and just the women I spoke to were just all so gracious and kind, and they understood. I was like, I'm just gonna mess this up, and thank you for bearing with me, and it was great, and I think that really helped a lot.
Right. So you mentioned something that was going back to the idea of uh, women's quote duties in the American society. You mentioned something there that I had wanted to bring up, and I didn't know when I should, but it's the idea of some women are being told this is a way to find a proper man,
Exactly.
and
Yes.
that and your friend's parents are like that. Maybe she didn't think of that going in, but
Right.
the overall quote scheme of the situation in the uh, lead up to try to get recruits, and the recruiting process is, hey, you could find your ideal mate this way too, as far as a woman finding a man.
Exactly. That was definitely something that recruiters are talking about. And I think for my friend's parents, I think you're right. That wasn't their intention, just
Right.
happened to be for them a side benefit. But yeah, you've got small numbers of women and a lot of men. So odds are pretty good if you're a woman, and not all of them marry.
Right.
But yeah, it's definitely that's what they posture this as, is like, you can't be married to come into the service after World War II. The exception is, if you served in World War II and then you got married and you wanted to come back and you had no kids, that's fine.
Mm.
But if you had no prior service, you were not going to be a married woman who comes in. They're like, no, 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 it's time to have children. but but there are a number of women, some of the highest ranking women, um, are married, never have children, or maybe they're not married, and they just stay in for decades.
Mhm.
Like General Mildred Bailey, her husband passes away in the 60s, but he was also a military vet himself. They never had children, and she ended up serving for decades.
Mhm.
So yeah, it becomes a great place, to find somebody potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, the book leads into 1980, but has that progression forward, or at least a forward thought of where women in the military have gone and are going to this day. How do you think those women in the 50s and 60s, or just the post World War II era, have really helped to open doors for the women today who are going into the military, because now more women are serving than ever proportionately.
Yeah, I think it's huge. I think that, yes, I acknowledge we had relatively small numbers in the 50s and the 60s, and it starts to shift in the 70s. And I recognize that women technically weren't in combat. Women were in combat in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, but weren't officially allowed to go into combat arms until recently, right? I
Right.
think all these little things that happened since 1948 all have a cumulative effect. So, these women who come in the 50s and the 60s are responding to the restrictions that are being given to them. And for many of the women, the setup the military offers is fine. They're okay with the pay. They're not going to sit there and go, wait, why can't I have this job and this pay over here? There'll be some that do, but a lot of the women
Mm.
are looking for a place to go, and they want an opportunity. And it's, for a lot of them, better than they'll get at home, or they can't afford college. And the GI Bill is not an option if you're a young unmarried woman who didn't serve in World War II, right?
Right.
Those opportunities. But I think as we see that cumulative effect, women start speaking up and saying, wait, hold on, this regulation is not working for me. Hold on, this problem here, we have issues, and we get these slow and steady changes that over time, I think, get us to those doors opening, that you get to a place where, okay, wait, we've got women who are not officially in combat, but they're serving in combat. We have to recognize that. So I think that they're all paving that way. A number of the women who served in the 50s and 60s would probably, some of them did say, and a lot of them might say that, oh no, we weren't in combat. That wasn't what we were there to do. But they also deeply respect the women who do that today. They started opening the doors that got us to where we are now.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, Tanya, I appreciate you coming on this evening and speaking with me. And I'm going to show this book cover again because it's just so
So
fantastic.
beautiful. I
It's
love
so
it.
awesome. It's simple, but it's awesome. Where it's like it's just you got your colors going on, but it's just that is an amazing
I love
cover.
it.
I love it. So, her Cold War, Women in the U.S. Military, 1945, 1980. I placed if you're on YouTube and Facebook, I placed a link to the UNC Press website to go directly to this book. Use the code down here, 40% off code, to get your 40% off. If you're on Twitter, please go to my last post after we log off, and you can find the link, and you can also find the code there. Thank you again to UNC Press for allowing us to use that code. Tanya, thank you so much for coming on tonight and talking about your book. It was awesome.
I love getting a chance to tell these women's stories. So
Yes, more of them needs to be told.
Yes.
You know?
If you know a woman in your life who served and you don't know their story, go talk to them, find out what you can, and let's keep the story going.
Absolutely.
Thank
Again,
you.
everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. We greatly appreciate that. Go grab your copy of the book, use that code, and we will see you on the next round of interviews. Take care, be safe, be well. We'll see you later.